Hey everyone, welcome to the Elm City Vineyard. As Josh said, my name's Matt, and a special welcome to you, especially if this is your first time here. We're glad to have you with us. Also, I should say, welcome back if you've been traveling for the holidays. I know a lot of folks have been out of town, traveling to be with family. Hannah and I had a great time with her folks. I think if Junia had her choice, I think all of her family would just live together all the time. Well, I won't say anything about what other opinions any number of people might have. But we had such a blessed, an amazing holiday season. Christmas is just always such an amazing time. And somehow, despite what you hear in the media, despite Starbucks changing their design in their cups and the concerted war on Christmas, somehow the show managed to go on. I jest, of course, but it's become like an annual thing now. You hear it regularly, American Christians expressing anxiety about our ever-decreasing cultural power. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, invited to speak to a group of American Christians a couple years ago, began by remarking on this sense of anxiety. It's as if, he said, you're not sure if it's possible to be the people of God without being in charge. Yes. If I might, he said, rather impishly, if I might, allow me to draw on the more than 3,000 years of experience that the Jewish people have of doing exactly that. And he began just this astonishing, beautiful talk, drawing on the history of the Jewish people captured in the Hebrew Bible that suggests again and again that not only is it possible to be the people of God and not be in charge, but perhaps that God's people do best when working from the margins, when living as what Rabbi Sacks calls creative religious minorities. And this week, we're beginning a new teaching series going through the beginning of the book of Daniel that will give us an opportunity to learn what it is to live as a creative religious minority, as people of God, unanxious about acquiring cultural power, but nevertheless engaged with culture for its flourishing. Because you see, the book of Daniel begins with a national calamity many times worse than a Starbucks rebrand. It begins this way. In the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he, that is Nebuchadnezzar, brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Jerusalem is sacked, the people led into captivity, the temple is ransacked. Completely dislocated and disempowered, the psalmist laments. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? The psalmist poses the question rhetorically, but as it turns out, the Bible actually offers practical answers, visions of what it looks like to be God's people living creatively for the common good from the margins. My sense is that, for better or for worse, this is our situation. Christianity is no longer the dominant cultural force in our nation. And if we're waiting to win some sort of cultural war, we're going to engage, in order to engage culture effectively, we're going to wait in vain. But in Daniel, we have a story of creative faithfulness lived from the margins, though in the halls of power. Faithfulness that sometimes looks like conflict with the powers that be, but often looks like really creative, sort of collaboration. So for the next 5 weeks, we're going to read the first 6 chapters of Daniel in this light, a manual for singing the Lord's song in a foreign land. And we'll talk about various sorts of ways that the land we live in may be experienced as foreign. But before we go any further, let me pray for us. Lord, I thank you that you are a God who walks with his people wherever they go. Lord, that you have plans we know not of. And so, Lord, I just pray that as we have this experience for these next 5 weeks in this book of Daniel, I just pray, Lord, that you would be teaching us, you'd be surprising us through the story of your faithfulness with your people, that you'd be expanding our imaginations and giving us courage to be your people. Come, Lord, have your way. Amen. The story goes on in Daniel. Then the king commanded his palace master Aspenaz to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. This may strike some as quite familiar, actually. I think we could pretty easily recontextualize the text this way. Then the university president asked his dean of admissions to bring some of the best and brightest young people, sure, what the hey, without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the halls of power. They were taught the literature and language of the world. The text translates almost alarmingly straightforwardly. Daniel and his compatriots have been drafted into an elite university education. But we could just as easily contextualize in other terms, in terms of the legal profession or any other profession. We could recontextualize in terms of the arts. In whatever corner of our culture we invest, we are to be taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And so we see the cultures that we live in aren't just our context. They're not just passive backdrops. They form us. There's an education, implicit when not explicit, that comes with living in a place. The pedagogy of the dominant. And those who are members of racial, cultural, and ethnic minority groups live acutely aware of this, right? The way that the dominant culture is constantly teaching, instructing, insisting on its values, its priorities, the stories it tells in its own mother tongue, the literature and language of the Chaldeans. And to live in a place is always already to be in a process of education, being schooled in what the culture at large considers valuable, the stories that it tells in narrating a life worth living. And so depending on the communities in which we belong, we learn to tell ourselves that life is about building a big bank account, gaining admission to an elite college, becoming famous, getting tenure, or getting elected. And it can take years to be able to tell a different story. My wife, Hannah, spent much of her college life and a good bit afterwards we spent working together, actually trying to learn to tell a different story than the one her parents and the educational institutions to which they entrusted her had told her about her life and her value. In short, she spent a better part of 6 years deciding not to be a doctor. And that was actually a process that took 6 years. That was about 10 years of work crammed into 6 years. At some point in the process, it struck me, I personally had never decided not to be a doctor. I don't know about you. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I'm also not a rodeo clown either. And I never remember making a conscious decision not to be a rodeo clown. Most non-doctors, I bet, have never decided not to be a doctor. But for Hannah, the decision not to be a doctor was an extraordinarily difficult one. The question of whether or not to be a doctor was somehow always already an obvious one, persistent one, put in place by a set of expectations. Such is the power of the education we receive, and my hunch is that many of us have analogous stories. An education we receive in our parents' lap as much as around the seminar table. Such is the power of the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And the power of this teaching becomes only more apparent in what follows. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years. They had apparently advanced standing in their collegiate education. so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. The palace master names them. Now, they already had names, right? And each of their original names contains a marker of the God of Israel, either El, the Hebrew word, borrowed as it turns out, but the Hebrew word for God, or Yah, a reference to the Hebrew proper name for the God of Israel. And in place of these identity markers, they received new identities rooted in the Babylonian pantheon. Belteshazzar in honor of Bel, Shadrach and Meshach in honor of the god Aku, and Abednego seems to be some sort of confused version of servant of Nabu. These are not neutral markers. They're signifiers of the transformation of identity that the education of Babylon is supposed to bring about. You were a child of God. Now your value comes from the gods, the established values of this other system, this dominant culture in which you are being formed. You were servants of God. Now you are servants of the gods of this world. So let me ask you, what have the powers that be, what name have they assigned you? What names have you been given? Names that take away your identity in God and place it instead in the gods of this age. Money, sex, power, success, fame. It's an important question to wrestle with. For me personally, I've struggled a lot with this name, servant of tenure. To be honest, the number of years that I've been in this place, we could get more specific. The servant of Yale tenure. There's been a name imparted through this education that I've received, and I've realized in the process that there's an education within or above the education. What I mean is this. There's the explicit education, the stuff that they teach you, they say they're teaching you, and then there's the education that comes in the process of going through learning all of that stuff that they're teaching you. So in my graduate program, I was a religious studies student studying the New Testament. I learned a lot of Greek and Hebrew and ancient history and methods of interpretation. But what that program formed in me more than anything else was a sense that my measure of success or failure in my life is about achieving tenure in an elite research university. That education, it turns out, even though it doesn't show up on my transcript, that education was probably the most profound thing that happened to me while in that program. I was talking with a friend recently who was considering going to graduate school, and I said, you have all kinds of great reasons for wanting to go to graduate school. You should write those down, because the main thing that you will learn in graduate school is to want to be a professor, a tenured professor at a research institution. You may have no interest in doing that now. Later you will. And you will have forgotten that you once had a different identity. You once had a different name. I think every subculture in our society has educations that work this way. They try to control us, even or especially if they exclude us. Harkness Tower attempts to impart an identity to those in the city who have no expectation of ever belonging to the institution that it represents. And it all turns on the imposition of an identity, the giving of a name. And we need to know, what name have we been assigned? Now, interestingly, the book of Daniel doesn't show us Daniel or his friends resisting their names. But it does routinely mark them as given names, names used by the Babylonians, but perhaps not by Daniel and his friends themselves. The part of the king's plan that does meet resistance from Daniel is the issue of the royal rations, the food and drink that they were served. We go on. It says, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. And we find this odd, and not just because we don't use the word defile on a daily basis. Defile just means kind of become unclean, The pagan education, the pagan name, apparently all of those are just things to be dealt with. Actually, we'll return to the education, which may have its own positive purposes, as it turns out. But the rations, that's where Daniel draws the line. Why? Well, the text says that the issue, right, is this defilement, right? But that doesn't help very much. I think there are two ways that we might make some sense of this. The first is the fact, of course, practically the food wouldn't have been kosher. It wouldn't have been prepared as God commanded his people's food to be prepared. That is, Daniel's concern, even or especially in this foreign environment, is that he remain obedient to God. Now, this obedience concern explains his aversion to the meat, and we'll come back to this obedience question in a moment. But the obedience question wouldn't extend to the wine. The wine shouldn't have been an issue. So why reject the wine as well, right? The meat makes sense. It wouldn't have been slaughtered the right way. Well, Daniel probably rejects the wine, I think, because he's mourning for his people. Remember, Jerusalem has been sacked. The people are in captivity. Daniel's landed a sweet gig in the Babylonian palace because he's a Judean elite. But the people as a whole are suffering terribly. And so Daniel thinks he can't partake in royal feasts while the city of God is in ruins and the people of God are in anguish. That is, alongside obedience to God, Daniel is also concerned to maintain solidarity with God's people. And I take it we would do well to consider these two values as well if we're resolved to not to defile ourselves in the various foreign cultures to which we belong. We need to take really seriously what obedience looks like and commit to living by obedience rather than by the various strategies and climbing the various ladders that the world offers us. Obedience, surprisingly, turns out to be a rather freeing way to live one's life. And I think we need to take seriously what it means to live in solidarity with God's people. And if we immediately want to ask, but who are God's people, then I would simply suggest that question is equivalent to the question, who is my neighbor? And refer you to Josh's fantastic talk on Jesus' astonishing answer to that particular question. That answer is basically that all people are creations of God and worthy of our love and concern. Perhaps more to the point, the Bible is clear again and again that the poor are in a special way God's people. And so if we want to consider what it would mean to live in solidarity with God's people, we would do well to begin by living in solidarity with the poor. Last fall, in the midst of student protests at Yale against the marginalization of minority students on Yale's campus, I heard an amazing sermon by Reverend Timothy Jones of Community Baptist Church in New Hallville. He delivered this sermon at the Yale Divinity School chapel. He was preaching on the story of Joseph, one of the fathers of the faith, beaten by his brothers and left for dead in a pit. And Pastor Jones noted that as Joseph's brothers were deciding what to do with him, they sat down and shared a meal at the top of the pit. I'd never noticed this part of the story. But it's this perverse thing, feasting while their brother was bleeding at the bottom of the pit. And Pastor Jones asked those of us who were in positions of privilege in the Yale community how it was that we could feast at the top of the pit while our brothers and sisters were bleeding at the bottom. He urged us, at the very least, to step back from the table until our brothers and sisters were rescued. His words still haunt me. I don't know, honestly, I don't know exactly what to do about them. But I certainly know that I don't want to be feasting at the top of the pit. I don't want to be enjoying royal rations when the people of God are in captivity. And as we're thinking this month about extending mercy, perhaps extending mercy also requires abstinence, fasting of a certain sort, lest we be defiled, made unclean by our callous indifference to the suffering of others. So let me ask you, where is God challenging you to grow in obedience and express solidarity with the people of God? Daniel resolves not to defile himself, and he acts to make a way for himself and his friends. The text says, "Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, 'I am afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king.' Then Daniel asked the guard," we got another one, I promise. There you go. Then Daniel asked the guard, whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. There's the text persisting in using their original names. "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations, and deal with your servants according to what you observe." It's an amazingly pragmatic strategy, right? Daniel says, look, I don't expect you to share my values, and I'm not trying to convince you of that. In fact, my sense is that despite our differences, we have some shared interests here. You want us healthy. I want us healthy. And more importantly, God is actually committed to care for us. And Daniel knows that obedience to God and solidarity with God's people will never run counter to God's commitment to care for us. And so Daniel simply invites the palace guard to try it out. And not even for himself, just to try out letting Daniel and his friends conduct themselves in ways that, from their point of view, will honor God. And the practical experiment works. So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. I was asking someone the other day, my hunch is that in the ancient worldview, this would be considered a miracle. Honestly, probably no less miraculous than any of the other miracles we hear about in Daniel. They turned down the meat and were plump and fat and happy. So the guard, this is easier for us to imagine. I think it would have been harder in the ancient world. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables, if you can imagine. So God's ways are vindicated, not by the violent overthrow of the palace regime, but by God's miraculous provision within the regime to bless God's people and to bless others through them. Daniel and his friends are well. The palace guard succeeds in his job. It's a win-win. And this sets up the turn to the conclusion of the chapter. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. At the end of the time that the king had set for them to be brought in, the palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among them, no one was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore, they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel continued there until the first year of King Cyrus. And Daniel and his friends finish top of their class, as it were. Why? Because God gave them knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. He gave them knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Now remember what the curriculum was. This is Chaldean literature and language. God made them experts in pagan mythology, polytheistic theology, and philosophy and astrology. God took these young men, Jewish elites whose educations to this point would have been almost exclusively in the law of the Jewish people, the Hebrew Bible, and God used what had been planted by the people of God and grew it in foreign soil into wisdom 10 times that of the foreign magicians. God did that. It's astonishing, right? It's as if God were to send a bunch of Jesus followers into a secular culture, and those followers were to come out better secularists than the secularists without being defiled. In fact, this transformation happens in the process of Daniel and his friends being sure to persist in obedience to God and solidarity with God's people. It's through this separateness, or at least in the midst of it, that God makes them the very best students of the foreign language, literature, and wisdom. It sounds crazy, but I actually think it's more or less exactly what God is doing here in this community. When you think of the foreignness of our culture, when you think of that which is culturally most distant from the church, what do you imagine? Do you think of the arts culture that champions atheism and lives kind of to challenge traditional values? Do you think of the culture of academia in general, or maybe specific fields like evolutionary biology or gender studies? Do you think of liberal politics? Or maybe you're on the left side, so actually you think of the opposite being something like investment banking or the world of hedge funds. I mean, let's get real, right? Where do we think the enemies of God hang out? Those who want to or are seen by Christians as wanting to tear down the church and take the cultural authority that the church once had. Is it the science lab? Is it Wall Street? Where is it? What are these people up to? And what would it look like if a group of Jesus followers were sent by God to be formed in those cultures, in obedience to God and in solidarity with God's people? What would happen if we came out on the other side? Oh, I slipped into weed, didn't I? If we came out on the other side more skilled and with more facility in the language and literature of these cultures? What if the best artists, the best evolutionary biologists, the keenest gender theorists, politicians, and I'll even include it, investment bankers, came from the church? Not, and you got to hear this, not as secret agents looking to amass cultural power and kind of sneakily get the church back in its place, but as genuine participants in the flourishing of the secular culture, the foreign land to which we've been sent. After all, the Bible has an answer to the psalmist's question with which we began, and we'll see it unfold as we read through the rest of Daniel. We find it perhaps most straightforwardly, this answer that we get to this question about how to sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land. I think we get the most straightforward answer in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet writing to the exiles in Babylon. It's actually in his letter, writing with God's counsel for Daniel and his friends, for the people taken to Babylon in captivity. Seek the peace of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its peace you will find your peace. Seek the peace, the shalom, the flourishing of the city. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it flourishes, you will flourish. And don't be afraid that you're no longer in charge. Yes, you've been bumped out of power, but your charge now is not to struggle to regain power, but rather to contribute to the flourishing of the place to which you've been sent in exile, powerless on the margins, but not without the power of God. Your captivity is an occasion for mission. So go, contribute, participate. Do not be defiled. Remain obedient and steadfast in solidarity. But these people who would make themselves your enemies are actually now your neighbors. Your well-being is tied up in theirs. And to that end, God supplies abundant gifts. Knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. All of a sudden, that education that we were unsure about at the beginning and still carries with it all the dangers that we talked about at the beginning, but that education suddenly also becomes valuable, especially when supernaturally charged by God. It can become a creative tool used for God's good purposes. And God also supplies insights into all dreams and visions. As it turns out, God is speaking to these foreign people. Just like God is invested in so-called pagan literature and wisdom, we learn here and we see throughout the book of Daniel that God is speaking to these people. God is invested in the well-being of all people, and he equips these particular people, these Judeans, to be his interpreters, to help these foreign people hear what it is that God is speaking to them. God's mission requires both divinely supercharged natural knowledge, as it were, and supernatural gifts of the Spirit, gifts of knowledge. As I said, I think that's exactly what God is doing here, equipping this community in both ways. And I think we're already starting to see this sort of mission happen in our community. One recent experience I had that captures this radical sort of mission that God has us on took place just before Christmas, actually, a few weeks back. The Yale Humanist community was celebrating New Haven's first winter solstice celebration, at least the first one held on the green. To some, I'm sure, this event was the front lines in the war on Christmas, not just celebrating the solstice, but in fact kicking off a campaign, Project Greenlight, to commission a sculpture on the green to stand alongside the Christmas tree, nativity scene, and menorah as a non-religious object to invite reflection on the turning of the seasons, the darkest day that begins to the return of the light. The event took place on Sunday the 20th at 4 p.m., out on the green. My friends in the humanist community invited me to speak briefly to voice my support for the Project Greenlight as a person of faith. I will admit it was my first ever solstice homily. But what I said was less important to me than the fact that out on the green, quite apart from my having invited anyone, and did I mention, right, during our service, there were no fewer than, I think, 10 ECVers present in support of our non-religious friends playing music, sharing in conversation, contributing in various ways. I think actually we contributed really significantly to the flourishing of this winter solstice event, contributing insight into what winter really means as a season that in a certain sense requires us, through blizzards and biting cold, to build real community in an otherwise anonymous city. A darkness that points to the light. I ended my remarks with this. So as a Christian pastor, I welcome Project Greenlight, and I look forward to having on the green a reminder of our shared humanity and the rhythms of our shared planetary home. It's kind of cool, right? We think about what this thing is doing as we spin around, right? That's amazing. A reminder for me as a Christian that the Christmas season I observe is itself rooted in these ancient rhythms. Christ, the light, entering the darkness. Christmas, I suppose, is a relative latecomer in interpreting the human significance of this time of year. It is a joy to pursue the big questions of life in your company, and I look forward to doing so in the years to come, as together we seek to light one another's ways. I think God was filling us with knowledge and wisdom in that place. And I know the ECVers scattered throughout the crowd have been gifted supernaturally with the ability to hear from God and share it in meaningful ways with folks who aren't following Jesus. And I don't know if any of that happened, and particularly on the 20th, but I know that that's happened in some of those relationships represented there with folks that bridge these two communities. As I said, one of the book of Daniel's core convictions is that God is speaking to those who wouldn't consider themselves part of the people of God. And one of the ways that God wants to use his people is to send us to help our neighbors hear what God is saying to them for the sake of the flourishing of our shared project of life together. We'll have many opportunities over the next few weeks to think and hear more about that as it happens again and again in Daniel. For this week, let me end simply by asking a few questions, most of which I've already asked. First, what names have been assigned to you? Our original identities, every single one of us in this room, whether we consider ourselves a Christian or we believe in God or not, I believe that our original identities are rooted in God's love for us as God's creatures. But we get assigned other names by the cultures in which we live and by which we are formed. Those names can be redeemed. I actually think we see in the end that Daniel and his friends are servants in a certain sense of their new lords. They do serve the flourishing of Babylon, but not at all in the ways that the dominant culture expects. Distinguishing between our assumed names given by culture and the identities that we have fundamentally in God is crucial. It's worth reflecting on this question. Second, where is God challenging you to grow in obedience to God and expressing solidarity with the people of God? Remember, these were Daniel's keys to avoiding being defiled, being made unclean. His daring, we're going to take on this sort of daring engagement with a culture that doesn't share our faith. These disciplines, I think, are very, very important. Third, what gifts do you need from God to contribute to the flourishing of our foreign land? Mission is never a matter of simply rolling up our sleeves and getting to work. To be used by God as God's instruments, we need to be equipped by God. And so it could be various things for different ones of us. Perhaps what we need is divine imagination, creativity for seemingly natural engagement in whatever subculture we're in. Perhaps it's supernatural gifting to be able to interpret what God is saying to our neighbors. The line between those two things, for me, gets blurred more and more that I walk into those things. But I think we can think about it both ways. Over the long haul, at any rate, we're going to need both as God invites us into this sort of mission. I'm going to invite the worship team to come forward as we turn to communion. In communion, we remember the mission of God that sent Jesus to come into this foreign land, though not that foreign, since he had a hand in creating it. But he came into our world and took on our flesh. And so when we come to communion, we come not just to remember that, but also with an opportunity to commit to imitate that extension, that willingness to walk into a foreign place, to be an expression of God's love to the world. So I would invite you, if you're a follower of Jesus, or if you'd like to become a follower of Jesus, as the band begins to lead us in a time of musical worship, I invite you to come forward to tear off a piece of the bread, Christ's body broken for you, to dip it in the cup, his blood shed for you, as a way of saying, Jesus, we remember your mission to come and be with us, and we commit ourselves also to join you in that mission, to love and serve the world and to contribute to its flourishing. As we respond, why don't we stand? I'd like to pray for us. Lord, the foreignness of our world we each experience quite differently. But regardless, Lord, we do just want to say that we, as your people, we are citizens of another place, in addition to our whatever belonging we have here. And so, Lord, I just pray that in this time you would speak most clearly to us that primary sense of belonging, that we belong to you. And so I offer myself, we offer ourselves to you because we are yours. To be formed by you, to be shaped by you, and to be deployed by you, to be used by you in the places to which you sent us. Would you teach us to be your people without worldly power, but full of the Spirit of God, to creatively follow you as your people in land that is foreign in various ways. Come, have your way.